All right, y'all, welcome to the Scott Horton Show. I'm the director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, author of the book Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and the brand new Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism. And I've recorded more than 5,500 interviews since 2003, almost all on foreign policy, and all available for you at scotthorton.org. You can sign up for the podcast feed there, and the full interview archive is also available at youtube.com/Scott Horton Show. All right, you guys, on the line, I've got Kit Klarenberg again. He is an investigative journalist and contributor at Mint Press News, and previously he's written for The Cradle, Declassified UK, and The Gray Zone. And here he is at Mint Press News with Dare Call It a Coup? CIA front threatens color revolution in Georgia. Welcome back to the show, Kit. How you doing?
Yeah, well, thanks, Scott. Well,
great. Happy to have you back on the show here. So, we talked with Dan McAdams last Friday about this, but you've developed the story a little bit further, and I think this is a really important one for people to keep track of. I was asked about this actually on OANN on TV last Friday, and I took a moment to clarify for the audience. We're talking about former Soviet Georgia in the southern Caucasus Mountains between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, because it's actually true. I've heard, anecdotes like this, that when we talk about Georgia, a lot of times people think you're talking about the state between Florida and South Carolina. And particularly one anecdote I heard was that when Russia, counterattacked against Georgia in August of 2008, that people thought Russia was invading Georgia. That was what TV said. And our Georgia is the only Georgia a lot of Americans have ever heard of in their life. So instead, we're talking about 8,000 miles away from here. It couldn't possibly be in the interests of anyone listening to this, but it absolutely is in the interests of our government to intervene over there. So why don't we start with that? Since the American people don't, why, Kit, does the U.S. government care who's in charge of former Soviet Georgia?
Okay, I mean it's interesting. It's interesting what you just said, because I was at university when the war between Russia and Georgia happened, and I had several American friends who were convinced that Russia had invaded the US and were urgently phoning home to make sure everyone was okay. But Georgia is a very small country. It's a population of less than 4 million. Estimates of area of its size, but this was a fundamental part of the Soviet Union for the best part of a century. Stalin was originally from there. In effect, in the wake of the end of the Cold War, it became to be led by an individual called Eduard Shevardnadze, as it was independent. Now, he was a long-time Soviet apparatchik and had served as the Soviet commissar for Georgia for many years, but he was also in many ways the West's guy. So he had been heavily involved in Mikhail Gorbachev's end of Soviet Union reform program, and had effectively ended the Soviet Empire as it existed in Europe. He had withdrawn Red Army troops from the Warsaw Pact countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia as it was then. He had signed arms control treaties with the US. He ended the Soviet war in Afghanistan, and he was on very friendly terms with James Baker. Somewhat ironically, given what would later transpire, he was in the meeting with Gorbachev and Baker where Baker said that NATO would not expand in 1 inch eastwards. And I say this is ironic because when he came to power in 1992, he immediately in Georgia, he immediately set the country on a program of kind of radical westernizing reform. So the economy was heavily privatized, which greatly benefited European and American oligarchs. He altered the law to allow foreign-funded organizations to operate with pretty much total lack of oversight or restriction in terms of their activities. And he also was pushing towards the end of the 20th century for EU and NATO membership for Georgia. But I mean, in the midst of this, there was an individual called Mikhail Saakashvili, who he was a lawyer who'd trained on a State Department scholarship at Columbia, of all places.
By the way, I'm sorry, I have to
he,
interrupt here
sorry.
to say it's the show's old friend, the other Scott Horton, who in the Bush years was absolutely heroic on torture issues and stuff like that, but is a severe anti-Russia hawk. He was Saakashvili's professor at Columbia.
Oh, really?
So if anybody
Wow.
ever reads that I taught Mikhail Saakashvili at college, I dropped out of ACC. That's the other Scott Horton. Sorry, go ahead. And no, in fact, other Scott insists that Saakashvili started out as a good guy and was really just, you mentioned his anti-corruption crackdown. In a lot of places, an anti-corruption crackdown just means picking on your enemies. But apparently he really believed and had read some Mises and understood you can't have market capitalism with all this corruption in the state. You have to have real protection of property rights and things like this. And so he really tried at first to make things better, but then eventually, he wasn't a businessman. He was a president. And so he did what all presidents do his very best to turn into a power-mad warlord, and ended up going completely crazy and eating his tie on TV.
Oh, yes. I mean, but I think that Saakashvili always had a bit of that in him. And so in 2000, George Soros visits Tbilisi, which is the capital of Georgia. This was at Shevardnadze's express invitation, and he was a guest at the presidential palace and all sorts of stuff. And he opened a Georgia division of Open Society Foundation. Now, on this trip, Soros also met with Saakashvili, who was at the time the government's justice minister. And not long after Soros departs Georgia, suddenly Saakashvili becomes a vociferous anti-government critic and quit his post and started up a party called National Movement, which then very quickly began receiving Western funding and Soros funding. And then so you fast forward to 2002, where all of these kind of Soros-funded opposition media outlets have been intensifying their anti-Shevardnadze coverage, and there's an election in November that year. It was ostensibly won by a coalition of pro-Shevardnadze parties, but some polling, which had been commissioned and conducted by the National Endowment for Democracy, indicated that the result was actually very much in the opposition's favour, and so there had been a falsification of the result. Now, this led to nationwide protests, and this student activist group called Kamara was at the forefront of them, and they bust all of these protesters into Tbilisi to cause havoc outside the Parliament building, and they had a large TV screen and speakers broadcasting Soros-funded media, and such was the fracas, and also the threat that this peaceful protest would erupt into violence. Shevardnadze resigned. Now, it was only subsequently that it was admitted that this was entirely the work of the NED. Now, I mean, just to get your listeners up to speed, NED was founded in 1983 following a series of very embarrassing scandals for the CIA. And its express purpose was to do overtly what the CIA used to do covertly, which is fund opposition parties, opposition media, activist groups, and other kind of anti-government elements in countries of interest to the State Department, which is all of them, pretty much, and apart from maybe like Israel, and then therefore create these kind of shadow armies of regime change operatives who could be mobilized to stir up unrest if a government didn't act as Washington required. Now, by that point, NED had already pulled off a similar ruse in Serbia in 2000, where they'd used this exact blueprint. They'd funded a student group called Otpor and then trained them in communication strategies and funded them to plaster Belgrade with anti-Milosevic graffiti and posters, and then this was all funded by the US, and it started to be exported to the other portions of the former Soviet sphere, as it were. But then so that you have the election of Saakashvili in January 2014, and he further intensifies the Western push of Georgia, and yes, it seems did drastically increase the country's gross domestic product and average incomes. Although poverty remained quite high. I think it was about a quarter of the population lived underneath the internationally recognized poverty line. And so in 2000, he'd been a Western darling throughout this. In 2008, with US encouragement, he started shelling civilian areas of there are two breakaway regions on the periphery of Georgia, on its border with Russia, and there's Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and they are populated by people who do not identify as Georgian, and their relationship ever since independence has been extremely strained. Shevardnadze came to power at a time when a brutal and bloody civil war was being fought by the kind of Georgia's rather puny and armed forces versus breakaway militias from these two regions. And so in 2008, he had the Saakashvili, with direct US encouragement and the promise of kind of unconditional support if he did this, started shelling these areas. Now, Russia intervened, and it was an absolutely brutal routing. Russia it literally shares a border with Georgia. It was very easy for them to invade. They had a much bigger, more powerful, better equipped armed forces. It was over in 5 days. Even that led to the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people and hundreds or indeed thousands of deaths. And then it seems Saakashvili very much fell out of favor with the Georgian public. It was revealed that prisons would basically become these politicized hotbeds of rape, where his rivals would get sent, and then they would be tortured at his request. It was clear that he was having his political rivals assassinated. This included oligarchs who were in opposition to him. And so in 2012, he lost fair and square, despite support from NED. And then he, resigned and was praised for his democratic principles by the US. But ever since then, a party called Georgian Dream has led a coalition government. They're the biggest party. Now, they are attacked for being pro-Russian by their detractors, which includes a lot of NED-funded groups, as it were, and also, and we'll get into this later in more detail. It's very clear that the West really doesn't like them, but they are slammed as being pro-Russian, in the pocket of Putin. The reality is that they are straddling a quite difficult tightrope between, on the one hand, pushing for greater integration with the West, while also, trying to maintain peaceful coexistence with Russia. Now, Russia is Georgia's second biggest trading partner in terms of imports and exports. It has significant. There's a large amount of money flows from Russia back to Georgia in the form of remittances. They have, they do, much to the chagrin of much of the population, I would imagine. They do have close historical, cultural, and other ties. So it doesn't make sense in that context for them to be enemies. In fact, actually, it's very much to, we're seeing in Ukraine what happens when Russia feels that its security interests are being threatened. It's just a pragmatic approach. Now, they have come under enormous pressure since the war in Ukraine began, to impose Russian sanctions, which overnight would destroy their economy. Quite literally, it would just be there would be a deep and cohering financial crisis from which they would not emerge, or at least never emerge, or at least not anytime soon. And so they've also been subject to enormous pressure, apparently directly from Kiev, to send weapons to Ukraine and open, if not open, a dedicated second front in the war with Russia, and they have steadfastly refused, which has not gone down well in with Zelensky or it seems the Biden White House. Now, one has to wonder in this context whether they were pushing ahead with this. It's called an AntiNGO law or a foreign agent law, but really it's neither of those things. What it would necessitate would be, if an organization receives over 20% of its income from outside Georgia, it would have to disclose that, and then there would be an accompanying label that they were a foreign agent of influence. But it's just basic disclosure, and it would be the context in which they would have to disclose it would be limited, and this effectively acts as a permit to operate. Now, this triggered absolutely. Sorry, one has to wonder whether the government pursued this because they were worried about another Rose Revolution, similar to the one that overthrew Edward Shevardnadze, coming to Tbilisi again. And so, they weren't wrong, because because these incendiary protests which broke out in the second week of March and, just got ever more incendiary. I mean, there were protesters burning things down, engaging in violent clashes with police, daubing anti-Russian graffiti on every available surface, and on social media and in the news media in Georgia, there were all of these individuals and organizations very viciously condemning this proposed legislation. All of them pretty much were in receipt of funding from NED, which is a very, very striking feature. And you also have, during this time, people like Samantha Power, that notorious, rather charmless warhawk, and Ned Price, the State Department spokesperson, who were pretty much directly threatening Georgian lawmakers, saying this law is contrary to the vision that we have for Georgia and to democratic values, and if you pass it, this will be you will be personally responsible for destroying Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration ambitions. And there was similar ululations and rhetoric about freedom and democracy and human rights issuing from these organizations that would be affected by this law, which is particularly odd, given that a lot of them publish this information voluntarily anyway. So I mean, typically in the modern day, when suggestions of foreign interference in unrest in a country abound, or a government is overthrown, or a president deposed, like suggestions that this was somehow orchestrated by the US empire one way or another are typically dismissed on the basis of appeals to the protesters' individual agency and their legitimate grievances. It is completely inconceivable that people were so righteously concerned about this very minor legislative amendment that they would take to the streets like that. Like, I mean, it's just inconceivable to me, and I can't imagine, that this would be the similar scenes would play out. Yes, in Israel, if if the government passed a similar law, because NED doesn't operate there. And so in effect, the government was successfully bullied and pressured into backing down. I mean, again, they might have worried that the initial protest would lead to attempts to overthrow the government. The protesters were on the verge of entering Georgia's parliament building, as happened in 2003. And I mean, I wrote in my article for Mint Press, I concluded this with a kind of very stark warning, which is that the threat of a NED-sponsored colour revolution in Tbilisi has not gone anywhere, and in fact will remain as long as NED operates on its soil. Fast forward to yesterday, and a publication called Georgia Today, the former editor of which is now an NED fellow and also a Fox News anchor, interviewed a Lithuanian MEP who'd previously spoken at an NED-sponsored event at the European Parliament, and he said that yes, that voters must choose between Georgian dream or EU membership. You can't have both. And yes, there are indications that there are clashes between anti-EU elements and pro-EU elements on the streets of Tbilisi. So, I mean, particularly in the context of in the context of the Russia-Ukraine war, where even the mainstream media is beginning to admit that far from this epic, heroic, miraculous David and Goliath success for Ukraine, this is actually a bloody quagmire. They are losing, and they're losing badly. And the US is also kind of in a position where it needs to decide what it does next, whether it goes all in or it withdraws its support for the proxy war. And there's talk of NATO potentially helping Ukraine try to take Crimea. In that context, opening a second front has probably never been more urgent. from the perspective of the war hawks in Washington and London and other centers of imperial power. So, yeah, I mean, will we see another attempted color revolution in weeks to come? I mean, quite possibly. And the installation of a government that is willing to sanction Russia and indeed is willing to open a second front.
Yeah, sorry, hang on just 1 second. Hey y'all, Scott Horton here for Tennessee Hot Sauce Company. Man, this stuff is so good. They get all different flavors: garlic habanero, honey habanero, pineapple habanero, poblano jalapeno, and the blood orange ghost. They're all so good, I swear. And for a limited time, Tennessee Hot Sauce Company is featuring official Scott Horton Hotter Than the Sun thermonuclear hot sauce. It's full of Carolina Reapers, scorpion peppers, Dr. Pepper, hydrogen isotopes, and all kinds of things that'll burn your tongue clean off. Seriously, it's really good. Get yourself a hot sauce subscription. Spend $40 or more and use promo code SCOTT to get a free bottle of Hotter Than the Sun hot sauce. That's tnhotsauceco.com. Hey, y'all got to check out these awesome busts of our hero, the great Ron Paul. They're made by the renowned sculptor Rick Casali. They're 13 inches tall, hand-painted bronze resin based on Casali's brilliant original. Y'all may have seen mine in the background on my bookshelf in some recent interviews. The thing is unbelievable. Check out this incredible piece of art at rickcasali.com/Ron Paul, and you'll see what I mean. Use promo code Horton and you'll save $25, and this show will get a little kickback too. That's rickcasali.com/Ron Paul. Casali is Casali. rickcasali.com/Ron Paul. And there's free shipping too. Okay, so there's a lot there, but I mean, one of the main factors here is that the president, who was elected with the support of this party, she happened to be in the United States at the time for International Women's Day or something like this, but she is very clearly supported by the United States. And so it's not really an attempt to overthrow her. It's just an attempt to overthrow or limit the power of the party that had helped support her rise to power, but that she's not necessarily obligated to. Isn't that right?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that the Georgian presidency is, ever since Saakashvili left office, because just again, this is important to underline, because this is so often a narrative in US sponsored color revolutions. Shevardnadze was, when the US et al. Turned on him, transformed from a semi-autocratic post-Soviet leader to Hitler incarnate, right? When Saakashvili came to power, he centered all power in his own hands. Like, actually, Shevardnadze was neither brutal nor was he a dictator in the authoritarian sense. He was far from perfect, but Saakashvili effectively turned Georgia into his own personal fiefdom, and ever since he left office, there have been efforts to greatly roll back the power and competency of the president's office. Now, the Georgia's current president, she was handpicked by Saakashvili. She's a fellow Columbia graduate to serve as foreign minister, I believe. And her background was, she was born in France, lived there all her life, and then served as France's ambassador to Georgia, coming herself from a diplomatic background. She doesn't speak Georgian very well. And indeed, it's a regular subject of ridicule in the Georgian media, that she can't speak Georgian very well and makes all sorts of verbal gaffes that make George Bush look positively articulate. And her daughter works for France 24, which is effectively France's BBC, and all that implies. And not only that, but she is the head of the White House International Press Corps. So, and yes, the president just so happened to be in the US while all of this unrest was kicking off, and posted videos of herself standing in front of the Statue of Liberty talking about how she opposed this legislation, of course, in a country that has very well established foreign agent laws of its own. And yeah, I mean, that's a very bizarre, this is just a kind of farcical aspect of this. But another truly ludicrous feature is that on top of US officials condemning this law in the most kind of menacing, ferocious terms imaginable, the EU got involved as well, and so there was Joseph Borrell and all these other pen pushers who were saying that, and if Georgia adopts this, it will be in stark contravention of the EU values of liberty and democracy and freedom, blah, 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 blah. Pretty much the second the Georgian government announced that they were shelving this law, the EU announced that it was going to pursue foreign agent legislation that was almost identical and would require organizations in the EU to disclose if they receive funding from elsewhere in the world. And they were specifically under this legislation, specifically organizations like Transparency International would have to register as foreign agents. I mean, that's how wide-ranging and sweeping it would be. So, we've gone from, you can't join the EU if you force NGOs to disclose their foreign funding, to, we're going to do it, and you're going to have to implement this yourself if you're a member.
Right.
I mean, it's absolutely ludicrous.
Well, and the proponents of the bill said that they were basing it on the American Foreign Agents Registration Act of 1938, which they had apparently read because they knew that it was passed the same year as that horrible gun control law and everything. So, they knew it was the time with that. And, of course, probably virtually every sovereign nation on the planet has a Foreign Agents Registration Act. Or the American position is it absolutely must be legal for every national sovereign government on the planet to allow other national sovereign governments to spend unlimited amounts of money intervening in their politics. Really?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is something to bear in mind, is that like Georgia remains a very poor country in international terms, and a tiny, even a few $1,000s would go a very, very, very long way. I mean, that would be many orders of magnitude in excess of their average monthly wage. And so in these circuit, if you were to flip this proportionally to the US, so for instance, the NED, USAID, and the State Department, and probably the CIA and other US government agencies too, spend around 40 million that we know of to try and get rid of Milosevic. And then at this time, the average wage in Yugoslavia, as it then was about $30 a month. Now, if this was regime change soldiers were very easily recruited indeed. But then if this was in reverse, this would be equivalent to Belgrade spending several billion to influence the outcome of a US election. Now, not only would that be not tolerated for a second by, quite rightly by any American citizen, it would also be completely illegal under US law.
Right.
The activities of the NED would not be allowed on US soil, and people would face criminal and civil penalties.
Hey, Kit Klarenberg, man, I'm witness to just in the last week Congress demanding to Matt Taibi, you deny that they intervened by buying some Facebook and Twitter ads, most of which were after the election, and most of which had nothing to do with politics and was all a hoax. And the Internet Research Agency was always just a clickbait farm and wasn't Russian intelligence anyway, and whatever. And this supposedly discredited Matt Taibi because he's unwilling to toe the line on this complete nonsense, and that was supposed to amount to a Russian coup d'etat, an overthrow of the American government, and installation of Donald Trump in power. Imagine if they had actually intervened, what the reaction would have been if it wasn't all just a giant hoax perpetrated by the Democrats and the secret police and their allies in the media, of course. And look, I want to get back to something that you said there earlier. It's in the article too, and I wrote about this in the book already, that this whole thing, as you mentioned, about agency there, you can name any of 50 coups America's done in the last, 75 years since the end of World War II. In every case, there are actual humans in the country who are the beneficiaries of the coup. Obviously, they all appreciate it. But the point is, they wouldn't have got the power if America hadn't intervened and handed it to them. So this whole thing about, you're denying their agency, Yeah, just like in the Orange Revolution, when America's guy lost, and then they just canceled the election and held another one and made sure that America's guy won. What does the agency of the sock puppets in the crowd have to do with that, other than they play their useful role with their little orange flag, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think I mean, there are several points to make there. I think, number one, the same people who cry, who make appeals to people's agency, see when there's an NED coup abroad. I mean, are the same people who literally thought that a Buff Bernie meme had, successfully manipulated people to vote for Donald Trump.
Exactly.
I mean, as peddled by the Internet Research Agency. Apparently people don't have agency when, yes, things that they don't like occur in domestic politics in the US and Britain. But I think that also as well is, if you want to talk about agency, where I am now in Serbia, I mean, it remains, a poor country where wages are pretty terrible, and the cost of living is rising constantly due to European-wide sanctions on Russia. I mean, Serbia's not passed them yet, but they're being pressured every single day to do so. I mean, in that context, actually, yes, as I mentioned, recruiting regime change activists is actually very easy, and often it's unwitting. So I know people out here who have in the past, much of their shame and regret, worked for NED funded rights groups or even media outlets, because they're one of the biggest employers here still. And in that context, when you are part of their network, you will receive emails, or you'll be part of some WhatsApp group where you'll be other people working for NED orgs of every stripe will receive this too, and you'll be asked by head office, someone like Samantha Power, to it'd be really great if you went along to this protest, or it'd be really great if you could tweet about this awful thing that's happening. And it seems relatively innocent on paper, but like in reality, this is creating this creates an artificial ecosystem of voices who are all pushing in the same direction and giving the appearance that there is this civil society wide unanimity or in on particular issues of interest to the US, when it's either niche or people don't care. And I think there is a very Serbia, like Georgia, is being subject to, as I say, enormous pressure to take an anti-Russian line, which the overwhelming majority of the public, not least due to Russia intervening to prevent in the NATO Yugoslav war in 2000, and intervening to prevent the kind of Western-backed terrorist group, the KLA, and NATO forces from pushing past pre-agreed lines into more of Serbia, which they were trying to do. The population would never ever accept this, but yet the government is being buffeted and being threatened with sanctions directly and indirectly by the EU and the US. Now, last September, there was a bit of a kerfuffle because the Belgrade City Council received an application from a European Pride organization to hold an event in the city. This was originally overruled by the City Council. And then the organizers, because they're EU backed, just went ahead and did it anyway. This created quite a lot of anger, not because there was a pride parade happening, but because their government had literally been overruled from overseas. And Serbs in general find it very annoying living in a country where they feel they have no power, and that they're really controlled from Brussels and Washington. Yeah. So there was some strife in the street. There was a bit of upheaval, but it was very mild, despite the fact that there was a lot of anger. And in the kind of circles that I move in here, there are a lot of people who would have, one way or another, voiced their displeasure with their government being overruled, but they decided to, to let it go, because they know that the slightest bit of internal strife can be weaponized against them, can be used to justify, hostile measures. Or indeed, outright intervention one way or another, and so they're choosing the hills that they die on very, very carefully. Quite clearly, this isn't the case in Georgia for all of the free agency wielding NGOs funded so lavishly by the NED and USAID and others. But I mean, I think that perspective is probably shared by Georgian Dream, because war with Russia would be absolutely catastrophic for them. But the people who the US is backing probably figure they have nothing to lose and everything to gain from it taking place.
Yep. All right. Hey, listen, really short on time here, but one last question real quick, if you can. Was there any indication that you saw at all, or even an argument made as to how this law was a Russian law? Because all the media said that, and I guess the protesters were saying that, but I never saw in any news report even an explanation as to why I was supposed to believe that, other than the Americans thought that if their paid groups were somehow limited, that would benefit Russia.
Well, I mean, the most ludicrous aspect of this is it would apply to Russian-funded organizations, of which there are, very few, and it would, allow. I mean, for people who are virulently opposed to Russia and Georgia, you would imagine that they would welcome this. It would of course detonate the notion that Russia wields all of this insidious influence over their politics. But I mean, the critics charge that this is modeled on Russia's foreign agent law. Now, it does seem that this legislation has in Russia been used quite arbitrarily, and it's led to people who teach French being branded foreign agents and being subject to harassment by authorities. I mean, that's been reported. Whether it's true or not, we don't know. But I would say just in general that Russia was the very first country to ban NED, and I think that was when there was a major shift in the way that the media reports on this stuff, because you can't admit that what this evil government is saying a US government agency does. You can't admit that that's what it actually does anymore. And there is so much in the public domain, very much indicating that that the NED is a CIA front and serves to destabilize governments. That all needs to be memory hold now. I mean, it's quite a remarkable turnaround. And I think, yes, that in that context, you need to frame any crackdown on foreign influence as somehow an attack on civil society and draconian authoritarianism and despotism unchained. But the reality is that Russia led the way on this. More countries are following. Venezuela, Iran, China have all taken measures to limit or even just outright ban the activities of NED in their soul. They're setting an international example, as they are in many other matters. And Washington hates it. So, of course, this needs to be demonized. So anyone following this example can be demonized on those grounds as well.
Yeah. Okay, great, man. Well, thank you so much for your time on the show, Kit. Really great article, really great interview. Appreciate you.
Yeah, cheers, Scott. Take care, mate.
All right, you guys, that's Kit Klarenberg. He's at mintpressnews.com. And this is a really good one. It has lots of background on, Ukraine previously, Georgia previously, the overthrow even of Milosevic in 2000 and the bulldozer revolution. Lots of good stuff in here. It's called Dare Call It a Coup? CIA Front Threatens Color Revolution in Georgia. The Scott Horton Show, Anti-War Radio, can be heard on KPFK 90.7 FM in LA, APSradio.com, antiwar.com, scotthorton.org, and libertarianinstitute.org.